America, in particular, why Mexico grows so slowly. And we have a really knowledgeable and distinguished panel here to debate that question. We're going to start with Santiago Levy, who's the Vice President for Sectors at the Inter-American Development Bank. We'll then go to Manuel Ramos Francia, who's the Deputy Governor of the Central Bank of Mexico. And then thirdly to Gordon Hanson, who's Professor of Economics at the University of California, San Diego. We'll then hopefully have some time for questions from the floor, but we'll start with Santiago.
Thank you, Tim, and good morning to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. So what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is to share with you some research as to what is a really big puzzle. And the puzzle is, if you look at Mexico over the last 2 decades, Mexico has been underperforming in terms of growth. It's been growing at 1.2%, but it's actually done a major effort on the macro side to stabilize the economy. It has opened the economy, as we all know, NAFTA plus many other trade agreements. It has enjoyed a demographic bonus. It has increased the years of schooling of population. And the investment rate, although low by East Asian standards, has been increasing. So all these factors would suggest an economy that should be growing very, very fast. What is also true is that productivity growth has been stagnating in Mexico for the last 20 years. Depending on which measure you use, if you do the standard solo decomposition, basically what you find is that productivity growth for the last 2 decades is 0 or arguably negative. So the big puzzle to be explained is why in this context is productivity growth stagnating. And what I want to do is I want to document that misallocation plays a very important part in this story, and I want to document that firm dynamics are also a very important part of the story. So this is an empirical approach to the issue, and what I want to do is share with you the data from the economic census. This is about as rich a data set as you can get in a developing country. I have access to 4 censuses for 1998, 2003, 2008, and 2013. Just focus on the last column for 2013. I have 4 million firms, so that's a lot. These firms are aggregated into 6-digit sectors. So these are very narrowly defined sectors. I can look at firms very narrowly defined. And these firms account for about 80% of all the employment in the census. I need 1 minute of a conceptual distinction to talk about the firms to make the rest of the story flow. In Mexico's institutional context, the Constitution and the labor law makes a very important distinction between workers that are salaried and non-salaried. This is a fundamental institutional distinction in Mexico. Salaried workers are covered by the standard protections against dismissal, minimum wages, and must pay contributory social insurance by the firms that hire them. Non-salaried workers are subject to a completely different regime. Firms can employ salaried workers, they can mix salaried and non-salaried workers, and they can also hire salaried workers illegally, breaking the law. And that generates 4 types of firms in Mexico. A formal and legal firm is a firm that hires salaried workers and complies with the law. A mixed firm is a firm that mixes labor of salaried workers and non-salaried workers. An informal and legal firm is the most important type of firm in Mexico. Is actually a firm that is legal but doesn't have any salaried workers. They're all non-salaried. And then there are informal and illegal firms that hire salaried workers but break the law. So this is some data from the census as to firms in Mexico. You can see the size distribution of firms between 1 and 5 workers, 6 to 10, 11 to 50, and 50 or more. And then you can also see the type distribution of firms in Mexico. And just 2 quick facts. 91% of all firms in Mexico have less than 5 workers. Less than 1% of all firms in Mexico have more than 50 workers. And more than 90% of firms in Mexico are informal firms. And the share of informal firms in total firms has actually been increasing between 1998 and 2013. In 2013, informal firms, both legal and illegal, absorbed 55% of employment in the census and 42% of the capital stock in the census. The notion that these firms don't have a lot of capital is flawed. each one has very little capital. But because there's so many of them, when you aggregate, they actually account for 42% of the capital stock. And if you see the growth rates over the last censuses, what you see is that there's been more investment in the informal sector, there's been more employment growth in the informal sector than there has been in the formal sector. You can calculate measures of the dispersion of revenue productivity. TFPR stands for Total Factor Productivity, Revenue Productivity. This is a measure that basically tells what is the value of 1 peso in capital and labor in each firm. If there was no misallocation, 1 peso of capital and labor in one firm should be the same as 1 peso of capital and labor in another firm. What this data shows is there's a lot of dispersion in total revenue productivity across firms, and that this dispersion has actually been growing over the last 15 years with the census data. I don't have time to present comparisons with measures like this for the United States, and even for measures like this for countries of Latin America, but even for comparable data, dispersion of TFPR in Mexico is actually larger than dispersion in other Latin American countries. Very quickly, these are just some quick regressions to just compare the revenue productivity across firms over the last 4 censuses. And in red, I'm highlighting that the revenue productivity of informal and legal firms is substantially below the reference category, which are legal and formal firms. So basically what this says is that 1 peso of capital and labor in an informal and legal firm generates about 63% less value than 1 peso of capital and labor in a formal and legal firm. Very importantly, the distinction between these firms and the rest of the other firms are very large. Notice also that there's a lot of differences in the productivity of resources across informal firms. The ones with non-salaried contracts are substantially more inefficient than the ones with salaried contracts. So this graph now is the revenue productivity distribution of all firms in the 1998 census and all firms in the 2013 census. This productivity distribution is constructed by adding the productivity distribution of all firms in each 6-digit sectors. So think of these bell as encompassing 690 individual bells, and then you simply sort of add them. And then what I want to share are the tails. If you look at the right tail of the productivity distributions, that's the story of the successful Mexico. The 2013 tail has more firms than the 1998 tail, so there are more firms with high productivity, and those firms have attracted more capital and more labor, and everybody would clap. The problem is that the left tail of the productivity distribution is actually attracting more resources than the right tail. So the productivity distribution got polarized between 1998 and 2013, as increasing misallocation, and yes, even though there's a subset of firms that are doing very, very well, the vast majority of firms are not, and that's where most of the resources are being concentrated. The census also has data for a firm panel between 2008 and 2013. And this is a really, really rich data set, because for the first time now, you can observe the same firm in 2008 and observe it again in 2013. So I've been working with this data for the last 6 months, and this is the first time I'm showing these results. These are really interesting results as to what is happening with firm dynamics. I'm going to call exiting firms, firms that were in the 2008 census, but not in the 2013 census. Surviving firms, firms that I see in both censuses, and entering firms, firms that I see in 2013 that were not there in 2008. Some stylized facts that come from the census data is that surviving firms between 2008 and 2013 create no jobs. All growth in surviving firms is by capital deepening. Entering firms are very important. Entering firms create all the jobs, not only themselves, but the jobs shed by exiting firms. And large firms, there's a lot of churning. 50% of the firms that in 2013 were not there in 2008. But as I will try to show you in a minute, the productivity of the firms that enter is no different from the productivity of the firms that exit, and the high productivity firms don't grow, and therefore, through time, the static misallocation from one period is connected to static misallocation in the next period. So this is the productivity distribution of exiting firms and surviving firms. I divide the productivity distribution in 3 segments. Up to the 25th percentile, I'm going to call that low productivity firms. Between the 25th and the 75th percentile, I'm going to call that medium productivity firms. And above the 75th percentile, high productivity firms. So 47% of all low productivity firms survive. And 44% of all high productivity firms die. They get a shock, and maybe because there's a problem with credit, and I think Manuel is going to speak a little bit more about that, or because of a problem with labor adjustment, these firms exit the market despite the high productivity. So if you ask yourself whether the exit process, the process of firms leaving the market, is the market weeding out low productivity firms and letting high productivity firms stay in the market? The answer with the Mexican census data is no. And I show below not only the number of firms, but the shares of capital and labor in exiting firms and surviving firms. And what you can see is that the exit process does nothing to improve the allocation of resources. What about surviving firms? Surviving firms, we see them twice. We see them in 2008 and 2013. We can see their size, and we can see their formality status. So these big matrix with numbers, and I couldn't think of any other way of showing this matrix, just walk you through one line to get a sense of what is going on. Take the first line. These are firms that were formal in 2008 that had between 1 and 5 workers. And then if you look at the columns, you see the status of the same firm 5 years later. So formal firms with 5 workers in 2008, only about 35% of those firms, 39% of those firms, were still formal with 5 workers. 48% of those firms that were formal in 2008 informalized by 2013. Look at the block below for informal firms in 2008. Again, take the small ones, 0 to 5. 98% of the firms that were informal stayed with the same size and continued to be informal. So many formal firms survive, but the only way they survive is by informalizing. The number of large firms that survived falls. Many firms survived by getting smaller. And the average firm size of surviving firms actually fell. What about the productivity of the firms that entered and exited, survived? These are the productivity distributions of the same firms in 2008 and 2013. These are only the survivors. They're exactly the same firms. As you see, the productivity distribution shifted to the right. This is good news. And in fact, surviving firms pooled more resources towards high productivity firms within the share of resources that surviving firms had. So within firms that survive, the high productivity ones pool more resources than the firms than low productivity. The problem is that firms grew very little and many more firms entered. These are now the firms that entered between 2008 and 2013, and I'm comparing the productivity distribution of entering firms with the productivity distribution of surviving firms. And one would expect that the productivity distribution of entering firms would be to the right of surviving firms, but in Mexico that's not the case. There is a lot of entry of low productivity firms, and the entry of low productivity firms absorbs a large amount of resources. So what is the net effect of this firm dynamics between 2008 and 2013? First, the dispersion of productivity increased. The tails got bigger. The left tail got more resources, and the reason it got more resources is because the entry and exit process low productivity firms increased their share of capital. High productivity firms decreased the share of capital that they were getting. And the share of labor the same. Low productivity firms increased the share of labor that they were absorbing. High productivity firms decreased the share of labor that they were absorbing. So this is, in my view, in a nutshell, the reason why misallocation, static misallocation, translates into dynamic misallocation, and why the productivity losses that in one period are converted into productivity losses in the next period. What I think I've documented, I didn't tell you the story of the why, it's much more complicated, but I've documented the stylized facts, and I think this should be a starting point for the discussion of why Mexico doesn't grow. The stylized facts behind that are, this is an economy in which there's persistent misallocation, there's growing difference in the marginal rate per products at the very narrow level. Same data sources, same measuring techniques, same assumptions. I've shown as well that misallocation operates systematically in the same direction. It is always channeling too many resources in the direction of firms with non-salaried contracts, and to a lesser extent, in the direction of firms with illegal salaried contracts. And it is always punishing firms with legal salaried contracts. I use that terminology instead of formal and informal, but I could equally state misallocation is operating in the direction of channeling too many resources towards informal firms, too few resources from formal firms. The distinction between salaried and non-salaried is actually, from the point of view of productivity, more important than the distinction between formal and informal, because it is really the large mass of firms with non-salaried workers that are accounting for these large productivity losses. Each of them very small, but when aggregated, making a large difference. And remember that the census only captures about half of employment in Mexico. There's even more informal employment outside of the census. I showed that the TFPR distribution got more polarized, and then I showed that firm dynamics were really the way in which this misallocation was translated from one period to the next. In a way, I call this dysfunctional firm dynamics. Instead of Schumpeterian creative destruction, we have partly Schumpeterian creative destruction, but we also have destructive creation. We have a lot of entry that shouldn't occur. We have a lot of exit that shouldn't occur. And we have growth of firms that is insufficient. This is 5-year data. I'm looking at firms with 5-year span. Yesterday afternoon, Angel Calderon presented a paper in this Congress in which he used shorter data using an alternative source of data from INEGI. And Angel shows very nicely that in a 6-month period, you get, again, a lot of entry and exit with the same pattern of firm dynamics that you're observing here. So there's actually probably much more churning than what the data of the census is showing. Think of what that implies in terms of jobs changes of workers by firms that are moving in and out. Think of what it does in terms of on-the-job learning, of acquisition of skills on the job, and all that. So let me close sharply at 19 minutes. This is my last slide. The story of Mexico is a story that has stagnating total factor productivity. That is the big puzzle, and that is what I think what needs to be explained. It is not a story about macro. Mexico's macro management, by and large, has been very sensible, and by Latin American standards, has been clearly above average. And after '96, we have had a successful macroeconomic stabilization. It is not a story about absence of foreign competition. After NAFTA, we signed 14 additional free trade agreements. Mexico exports more manufacturers than all of Latin America put together. So it is not a story about competition, and it's not a story about human capital. I didn't have time to show some numbers here, but there's been a large increase in the human capital of Mexican workers, and actually, because of misallocation, Luis Felipe and I have a paper arguing that because of misallocation, returns to education are falling in Mexico because informal firms are intensive in low-skilled labor compared to formal firms. So what is happening in Mexico, you might be puzzled, is But all these reforms that have been done to increase efficiency, what about them? And in my view is that these reforms have been offset by other forces in the economy that are deeply rooted in Mexico's institutional and legal architecture that favor firms with non-salary contracts, and it is associated with the way social insurance is structured and the way taxation is structured, and to some extent mimicked by behavior credit. These forces are deeply rooted in Mexico, and they will not be fixed by more foreign trade agreements, by further efforts on the macro side, or by more investments in human capital. Not that that shouldn't be done. Of course, we should do all that. But if Mexico really wants to grow, it must tackle these deep institutional obstacles that are embedded in the architecture of its labor laws and its social insurance program. I stop here.
So let me call on our next speaker, Manuel Ramos Valencia, and he's same thing, about 15 to 20 minutes.
Okay, so good morning, and first of all, thank you to Santiago and to the iEA for the invitation to speak here. The kind of approach that I'm going to talk about is very similar to Santiago's. We also believe, and when I talk about we, it's Santiago Garcia Verdu, who works at the central bank with me, that basically the deep problem concerning Mexico and growth lies at several ways why resources are misallocated. Of course, we can talk about the reasons about this misallocation, as Santiago was saying at the end of his talk. Those are a little bit perhaps more talks about political economy. We can also talk about the dynamics of this perhaps faulty institutional design. For example, Ryan has talked a little bit about this in the sense that these interactions economically, politically, and socially in economies like Mexico perhaps lead to equilibria, or to an equilibrium which are very unfavorable and yet, unfortunately, extraordinarily stable. But I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about more of a different channel concerning how misallocation of resources basically affects productivity and thus growth. And well, Santiago, just again to put in context this paper concerning what Santiago just said, perhaps, I mean, the channel that he was talking about was, again, economic design concerning social security, taxation, that basically has led to these distortions in the economy that lead to this misallocation of resources and thus low productivity growth. In my case, in the case that I'm going to be talking about, there's another channel, which is the credit channel. And basically, it's also going to lead to a situation where we believe that this misallocation, as I'm going to talk about in a moment, of credit leads to distortions in an economy and basically leads to a situation where too many resources are channeled perhaps not to the best projects or to the best investment in the economy, which also leads to the kind of dynamic inefficiencies that Santiago was talking about. So I think that it's clear that the nexus between financial development and economic growth has been a matter of keen interest, both for the profession and for policymakers alike, like myself. I think that three broad themes can be, or seem to be, particularly relevant to gain a better understanding of such a process. First has been the extent to which there is a causal relationship in the referred link, and if such, what are the mechanisms behind? That is, the mechanisms that basically relate more credit, in general terms, to more growth. Second, the financing decisions made by firms, which entail a number of well-known economic phenomena, prominently adverse selection, costly state verification, and moral hazard. This strand of the literature is also quite well known. Third, the role played by the level of competition in the banking sector. There has been very intense discussion concerning this, and perhaps it has also led to this discussion about the trade-off between competition and stability, which has been particularly relevant in terms of financial crisis in 2000 and 2009. So I would say that basically the connection or the relationship between financial development and growth has been through these main currents of discussion. Still, we think that while important, relative less attention has been paid to understanding the role of competition across firms and sectors to which financial resources, in particular bank private credit, are allocated. In effect, it is not only pertinent whether there is a credit growth or not in an economy, but as would also be evident, also how it is being allocated. So on the whole, banks evidently care about the characteristics of the firm and sectors to which the resources could potentially be allocated. To begin with, I think that one could assume that under perfect competition, creditors should pay more attention to the most productive and economically active sectors. However, in a more general context, the level of market concentration prevalent in a sector could explain part of the bank's decisions. From the point of view of a banker, a great sectorial concentration might be desirable. In effect, it may enable it to allocate its financial resources to those firms with more market power, benefiting from the rents. On the other hand, from the point of view of society, for instance, this might be deemed detrimental since output levels could remain lower compared to a situation where there is more competition. Arguably, this is partly supported by the presence of additional credit. Now, against this backdrop, we empirically assess the extent to which relative growth in labor productivity, output, and wage on the one hand, and growth in the proxy of market concentration on the other, can explain relative private credit growth at a sectorial level in the Mexican economy. And to that end, we divide 6 sectors that work or function in the economy into 2 groups. One is those sectors with low average concentration. This group is made of the commercial, agricultural, industrial sectors, and those that have a high average of concentration. This group has the services, excluding financial services in this case, construction and communications and transportation sectors. So basically, we divide the economy into 2 groups. The first group presents a low, on average, relative concentration, and the second sector, the converse. Now, centrally, we estimate 2 panel regressions, one for each group with fixed effects. We postulate relative credit growth as the dependent variable, and by relative growth, we mean the difference of the growth of a variable in the sector and the growth of that same variable but for the economy as a whole. Now, very quickly, in terms of our main data, we use outstanding bank private credit aggregated with data from the Comisión Nacional Bancaria. We also use economic indicators as published by INEGI. We use also data wage data that is provided by the Mexican Social Security Institute and so on. I'm not going to dwell very much into that, although it's an empirical paper. But more specifically, in terms of a model, we do not estimate nor calibrate an economic model. Our work is mainly empirical. Still, we do tweak a standard profit maximizer firm model that provides us a useful framework to our discussion. Why? For example, or for instance, assuming that credit is a non-decreasing function of profits from a sector, it allows us to learn about the science of the coefficients associated with a number of our key regressors. So basically what we want to do is we divide the economy into 2 sectors, one that is more highly concentrated than the others, and we see whether this concentration has an important impact on the way banks allocate credit sectorially. And basically, we believe that, again, there are very clear reasons why there would be very important incentives for banks to try to allocate, as I'm going to talk about, credit to those sectors that are more highly concentrated. And one of the main reasons for that is perhaps through that channel, they basically get to capture some of the rents that these highly concentrated sectors do have. So first, we document the changes in concentration, how changes in concentration contribute to explaining relative credit growth, variability in both sectors. Now, nonetheless, in the group with high average concentration, the contribution is notably greater than that of the group with low average concentration. Evidently, under reasonable, again, competitive conditions, one would find little reasons why concentration ought to influence credit growth so markedly. In view of that, we explored what other factors can contribute to explaining the variability in credit growth, particularly so for the group with low concentration. Now, interestingly, we find evidence indicating that credit growth seems to be also explained by relative labor productivity, economic and wage growth rates in the group with low concentration. On the other hand, the same variables appear to contribute very little to explain relative credit growth in the group with high concentration. This is not to say that in the latter group, credit does not depend on such factors. Rather, we see it as evidence for its lessened relative importance. Now, it is worth mentioning that we separately control for exports, imports, and nominal and real exchange rates, the relative cost of credit, the relative cost of marginal credit, and a number of cross effects, among other factors. Well, in some cases, these controls are statistically significant. In general, our main results are maintained. So by the same token, besides concentration growth, it is clear that factors such as labor productivity, economic and wage growth rates seem to influence credit growth for the group with low concentration. In contrast, their effect on credit growth for the group with high concentration is harder to document. We believe that at least three mechanisms might explain these results. The first one, some type of adverse selection in that a group of sectors could be obtaining additional credit based more on their market concentration and less so on factors such as their labor productivity. Second, a result which has been explored where allocating and monitoring credit could be typically less costly in a concentrated sector. Third, in tandem, this could lead to the possible presence of counterproductive dynamics between concentration and credit growth in some sectors. So we present some further empirical evidence in line with two of these three mechanisms, that is the first one and the third. We think that the panel regressions are evidence supportive of the first mechanism, specifically the results in which relative labor productivity, economic and wage growth rates are able to contribute to explain the variability of relative credit growth in the group with low concentration. In contrast, in tandem, these referred variables contribute very little to explain credit growth in the group with high concentration. Now, moreover, bearing in mind we are using panel regressions and that they have R-squares of about 0.5 and 0.4 for the low and high concentration groups respectively, we have calculated some ballpark trade-offs between the factors determining credit growth. On these exercises, we do have some remarks. Now, potential increments in labor productivity in the low concentration sector will be unlikely to catch up with possible rises in concentration growth in the group with high concentration to obtain equivalent changes in credit growth. For instance, all else being equal, it would take a 2.8 standard deviation increase in labor productivity in the former group, given a 1 standard deviation rise in concentration growth in the latter group to obtain equivalent rises in the growth of credit, all else being equal. Now, by the same token, other variables such as relative economic growth would need to exhibit higher increases in the low concentration group to match equivalent credit growth due to changes in concentration in the high concentration group. While these are ballpark calculations, we believe they are supportive about the potential magnitudes of these trade-offs. More generally, with the exception of the communications and transport sector, concentration indices have presented a downward trend in our sample. We think that these trends are possibly compatible with a more efficient allocation of private credit. Nonetheless, given its apparent sensitivity, a potential deterioration in the level of such indices could lead to significant changes in credit allocation. In effect, our estimations highlight the potentially large sensitivity to those changes, particularly so in the group with high concentration. Now, regarding the cost of allocating and monitoring credit, one can presume that under more concentrated sectors, such costs could be lower. Suppose there is a fixed cost for assessing each firm at the beginning of a credit and its monitoring during the lifetime of the credit. To take a polar case, in a highly concentrated sector, a bank would probably need to assess a handful of firms. In contrast, in a sector which has little concentration, it would need to assess several firms. In the former case, there is possibility that allocating credit would lead to a relationship lending between the bank and the firm in question, giving place to lower costs into the future, as well as the possible provision of other banking services to the firm. Now, we do not dwell very much on this mechanism. Third, on the possible presence of counterproductive dynamics between concentration and credit growth, we have estimated two panel vector autoregressions, p-vars. This allows us to explore the dynamics of our variables in a somewhat more general setup. In particular, based on their estimation, we are able to assess the response of credit growth and concentration to shocks on either variable. To simplify the identification of shocks, we have posited the referred variables as endogenous and assumed that the relative labor productivity, wage, and economic activity growth are exogenous. Now, in addition, we have assumed that concentration does not react contemporaneously to changes in credit growth. Anybody that has worked with VARs would possibly deem to have or to find these assumptions reasonable given the type of results that we want to or the type of hypothesis that we want to explore. So one can summarize our results as follows. First, for both groups, a shock on concentration growth leads to a positive and statistically significant response from credit growth. We have seen analogous results in the panel regressions that I talked about a little while ago. Second, on the other hand, when we ponder the case of a shock on credit in each p-var separately, we find different responses. Specifically, in the group with low concentration, we observe a response which is not statistically significant. In sharp contrast, in the group with high concentration, we obtain a response which is positive and statistically significant. We see these results as evidence of the possible presence of a feedback between concentration growth and relative credit growth. We have referred to it as counterproductive dynamics, since it could be contributing to support the level of concentration in some sectors. Now, this might give place to costs accruing through time, that is, dynamic inefficiencies. So basically what we wanted to do is explore another channel to the one that Santiago has been working. I consider that Santiago's work is crucial to understand basically the very low productivity growth that we've had. In fact, if you look at the numbers in Mexico of TFP, basically we have even had decades where TFP on average has decreased, not increased. And nevertheless, we do believe that there are further channels to the channels that he referred to, Social Security and taxation, which basically concentrate those distortions on the labor market, even although they have important repercussions again on investment and the kind of technologies that firms adopt and so on. We do believe that there are other also more direct channels, that is, that come basically through investment or how investment in this case is funded, that also lead to misallocation of resources. And not only that, but this type of misallocation, given the nature of the channel that we've been exploring, which is again how we allocate or how banks allocate resources through time, basically also lead to dynamic inefficiencies. So the story, I think, complements that of Santiago, and we're working very hard to complement this story a little with a more theoretical model, but we believe that these empirical results go precisely in the same type of direction as Santiago's results. Now, the last thing that I'd like to say is that not only do we get, again, this type of dynamic inefficiencies from this channel per se, just as Santiago was also commenting on his channel, but we do think also that some of these channels, let them be taxation or Social Security or credit, they also feed onto each other. So the dynamic inefficiencies basically also come from this side. So that would be my presentation. I think that I more or less complied with the time. Thank you very much.
Third speaker is Gordon Hanson.
Thanks to Santiago to ask me to be part of this panel. My area is in economic growth. I work on trade and migration. So I think the reason that Santiago asked me to participate is that about 7 years ago, I wrote a paper called Why Isn't Mexico Rich? For the Journal of Economic Literature that summarized what the literature had to say about Mexico's slow growth performance. And I'm going to use my brief time today just to review what we've learned about the underlying causes of Mexico's underperformance and build on the deep dives that Santiago and Manuel provided into two important mechanisms. One, the role of informality in productivity growth in Mexico, and the other, the provision of credit. So if you pick your comparison group of countries, so in the upper left here, we have a comparison group of Latin America. In the upper right, we have a comparison group of Southeast Asia. And in the bottom, we have a comparison group of Eastern Europe. Mexico is in green. Looking back in terms of its economic growth relative to 1990, Mexico underperforms. If you look at middle-income nations, the only nation that Mexico tops over this time period is Venezuela. And that's a feat of which one can be proud, I suppose, but probably not that proud. The explanations that have been put on the table are legion. Going back to a paper that Manuel wrote with Daniel Chequear at the Bank of Mexico about a decade ago, one of the things they looked at was the importance of high prices for key inputs in Mexico's economy. Electricity prices were high, telecommunications prices were high, the education sector was dominated by a union intent on preventing reform, and taxes created distorted incentives for firms to remain informal. On that count, what has happened in the 10 years since? Progress. We've seen reform in the energy sector, reform in the telecommunications sector, reform in the education sector, and reform in taxes. Now, those reforms are pretty recent, and so it might be too early to expect much payoff, but in terms of checking boxes, Mexico has checked that box. What about area number 2, social policy and informality? So while the share of total employment in the informal sector in the economy as a whole has fallen, what Santiago has identified are a key set of issues that create incentives for new firm creation in the informal sector, and that if you think about how that translates into dynamic incentives for investment, is likely to be a very key drag on growth. So item number 2, still a key problem for Mexico. Item number 3 I looked at was competition from China. So Mexico had the bad luck of entering on its process of export-led development around the same time that China was doing the same thing. And if you looked at countries that were specialized in manufacturing, Mexico stood out as being one of only 5 or 6 countries that approached China in terms of the degree of specialization in the manufacturing sector. And so what that meant was, just as Mexico was trying to spread its wings in the global economy, it faced intense competition from China, in particular after 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization and its export growth really took off. That kind of stopped in 2008. The remarkable decade of productivity growth that Johannes van Wiesenbroek and Lauren Brandt have documented came to a screeching halt, recent work of theirs shows, in around 2008. So the China shock, which was vital for closing off market opportunities for Mexico in the 1990s and in particular the 2000s, has receded substantially, creating new opportunities for Mexico. Fourth is the role of the undersupply of credit. And this is what Manuel spoke of in his presentation. And here let me just give you, again, 3 sets of comparison countries showing domestic credit to the private sector as a share of GDP for Mexico, again in green, relative to 3 sets of comparison countries. Other countries in Latin America, countries with similar income in Southeast Asia, and countries with similar income in Eastern Europe. Here, Mexico is able to beat out Argentina in a difficult period in Argentina's economic history. I suppose every period is a difficult period in Argentina's economic history. And it performs about as well as the Philippines. So if we had to look at a continuing factor plaguing the Mexican economy, along with the interaction of social policy and formality, you'd have to put the continuing constraints in the supply of credit at the top of the list. Let me add, however, a new explanation that we wouldn't have had on the table 7 or 8 years ago, and that's Mexico's dependence on the United States, to which Mexico sends about 80% of its exports. I got interested in Mexico 27 years ago when I was doing the dissertation for the research for my dissertation. I was a visiting professor at the Colegio de Mexico, and I funded my dissertation by working for the negotiating unit that was behind NAFTA. And here I saw a bunch of young PhD economists guiding Mexico's economic policy, and I thought, one, wow, if you get a PhD in economics, people immediately give you a whole lot of power. And 2, the idea that Mexico was going to become the next Korea. So that was the idea, that Mexico was going to follow the Korean strategy, and what we were going to see was a quarter century of breakneck growth to rival that we'd seen in East Asia, and export-led development was going to be a key part of that. So we know what the data say. The data say that Mexico did become a follow-up process of export-led development, and that was fundamental to the reorienting of its economy, but the growth didn't follow. What did follow was increasing dependence on trade with other NAFTA countries. So what we see here is trade between Mexico and its NAFTA partners, trade between Canada and its NAFTA partners, and trade between the US and its NAFTA partners. And for Mexico, trade with its NAFTA partners now accounts for almost 25% of GDP, something that has risen over the last, since the global financial crisis. So for Mexico, this creates a real dilemma. It creates a dilemma not just because of the risk involved in being dependent on any individual economy as a market for your goods. It's because the US is living through a very difficult moment at this point in time, not just because of the election of Donald Trump and the uncertainty that creates around US economic policy, but also because the US has had a continued sluggish economic growth and even more dismal productivity growth. Since the rebound from the Great Recession in the United States, multi-factor productivity growth, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, has averaged only 0.4%, and in fact was slightly negative last year. So if you look at Mexico becoming increasingly dependent on the US market as a destination for its goods, you would want that market to be growing rapidly, and instead what we see the US in the throes of something that looks like secular stagnation. So the challenge then for Mexico and other NAFTA countries is whether you can think about expanding markets outside of North America and penetrating Asia in particular more intently. And here you can think of there being two scenarios for Mexico. One is the motor vehicle scenario. Go back to the moment in time I talked about just a second ago when NAFTA was being negotiated. What were Mexico's key sectors for exports then? It was automobiles and auto parts. It was the apparel and textile sector, although that was already in decline, and it was the electronics sector. So let's look at what's happened to Mexico's revealed comparative advantage in those sectors in the intervening 25 years. I don't need to tell you what happened to apparel and textiles. It just kind of went off a cliff. What happened in electronics, you see that in the right panel, was a steady decline in its revealed comparative advantage alongside the dramatic increase in China as the center for electronics production globally. The bright spot for Mexico was automobiles and auto parts, where Mexico joined with Canada and the United States to create a robust production network that served primarily the North American market. You add on to that two smaller success stories in aerospace and in medical devices, and you have pretty much the story of Mexico's manufacturing export success over the last 25 years. So if we look going forward, what Mexico has done is reap the easy gains of reaping greater efficiency from forming the production network that now is the North American market. If Mexico wants to continue to grow through exports, one of two things has to happen. Either the US economy needs to grow much more rapidly, creating a larger market as a destination for Mexican exports, or the North American industries need to do a better job of penetrating foreign markets. On this score, the news doesn't look terribly good. Wall Street Journal yesterday, what did we see? In response to concerns over the future of NAFTA, Ford has decided to relocate the production of its economy automobile, the Focus, from Mexico to China. So the concern is not just that Mexico may not be able to replicate the motor vehicle success in other sectors, but that its success in this key sector may come into question on its own. And so that makes the NAFTA negotiations, which are set to begin within a few weeks, of even more crucial importance. And here there is a bizarre bit of optimism on the part of a number of industry players who are engaged in NAFTA. And the storyline goes like this. And that is, in the face of disorganization in the Trump administration, we're going to open NAFTA renegotiations, and it's going to create the opportunity for anybody with an agenda to come in and determine what the agenda is going to be, because the Trump administration simply doesn't have an agenda, and they haven't hired people to set one. And so by that reading, some industry players see the renegotiation of NAFTA as being an opportunity to bring in TPP elements regarding the digital economy through the back door. There are other players that see the NAFTA renegotiation as creating an opportunity for changing policies that restrict trade in services, in particular in the medical sector. So you had to think about a growth opportunity for Mexico. Taking care of the US elderly would be an enormous opportunity. And so this is, I don't know if you'd want to count on this option, because you're counting, one, on the inability of the Trump administration to get its act together, but its ability to have its act together enough to actually conclude a NAFTA negotiation that would, by some stroke of luck, actually create new market opportunities for Mexico. But it tells you about the difficulty in the global environment in which that Mexico is currently facing, that you're having to bank on that sort of perhaps fanciful scenario to think about real opportunities for growth in global markets. I want to leave you with one slide which may indicate that we might not want to look at other middle-income countries as a source of comparison if we want to tell a good story about economic growth in Mexico. So if you look at standard data on per capita GDP, what you see is the complete absence of convergence in GDP between Mexico and the United States. But that's not the right comparison. You want to be comparing similar workers in the two countries, what they would earn in one place versus another. This is difficult to do because what you need is longitudinal data, and you need to be able to track workers as they move from one side of the border to the other. So what I did was, along with Craig McIntosh, is to do a simple exercise in which we take data from the World Development Indicators for gross national income, adjusted for PPP, and then we impose the assumption that income is log normally distributed. If that's true, we can take mean income and we can take the Gini coefficient to back out the variance of income, and we can calculate incomes at different percentiles of the income distribution. And then what we did was to pick the 50th percentile of the Mexican income distribution, just the typical Mexican worker, and compare that to the percentile of the US income distribution, which would match the average gain in income we observe when individuals migrate from Mexico to the United States. And that's about $10,000. That income percentile would be the 25th. So if we look at the ratio under these rather heroic assumptions of income at the 50th percentile in Mexico to income at the 25th percentile in the United States, and this takes into account differential GDP growth in the two economies, differences in the cost of living, and differences in inequality, which has improved in Mexico relative to the United States, what we see is actually a closing of the income gap. So the one silver lining we may have here is that, well, if you compare Mexico to other middle-income economies, the story might not look that good. But if you compare yourself to the United States, what you see is hearty relative income growth. So that's the silver lining I will leave you with. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks. There were three excellent presentations there. We have about 15 minutes for Q&A. So if you'd like to raise your hand, if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, we're going to circulate the microphones. Yeah, I've seen one over here, I've seen one over here. So just, I'm going to collect them in batches of 3, I think, and then return to the panel. So this is the first one here. If you could say who you are, that would be nice. And Danny, thank you.
Ángel Calderón from El Colegio de México. The question is addressed to Dr. Ramos Francia. And from the first presentation, I think the key message is you cannot get the full story if you don't go from the forest to the trees, but looking at the trees as part of the forest, i.e. the key message is heterogeneity. So let's do the hard work of going into micro data sets, even if there are 10 million establishments. Let's do the hard work to follow them over time. And let's see how each establishment and each firm is exposed to prevailing distortions. One of the prevailing distortions you emphasize, as I understand, is the lack of competitiveness or monopoly power and its relationship with access to credit. So your story is quite persuasive, but cannot be disentangled. You're making a story of disaggregation, a story of trees, right? Using aggregate data. And I think that's as far as we can get now because of the lack of, if I may say so, because I'm an academic, I can be very critical, the lack of political will of politicians and people in charge of economic institutions that they don't want to merge data sets. In other countries, we see in Colombia the equivalent of Banking Commission asking the equivalent of INEGI to merge their credit and balance statements data sets with the census establishment. So they are there, the methodology is there. If you can merge to economic census, you certainly can have a micro data set that includes the possibility of merging that distortions. And so your arguments can be some sort of not nested with the idea that the other distortions are probably more important, and probably I mean you can even merge the fiscal distortions or whatever, because you have now fiscal very good data sets. So my remark is
if you could keep, yeah, thank you. If people could keep their intervention short, they can maximise participation. We'll come over here to Danny. I thought there was someone else there. And I'll come there, and then we will have a second round. Hopefully, if the questions are brief, we'll be able to have multiple rounds. Thank you.
Thank you very much for some interesting presentation. My question will be very brief. It relates to Santiago's presentation. Firms that exit may exit and die, but they may also exit and switch into other sectors. Firms that enter may be new firms, or they may be switches that come from other sectors. Now, this issue has been shown to actually have an important implication for the story you tell, and I'm just wondering how that plays to your story.
Okay, so.
Thank you. I think this has been a great session. Just a question, I guess a couple of questions to Santiago. The numbers you've presented are just absolutely fascinating in terms of showing not just the importance of the salaried, non-salaried divide and how resources have been moving in the wrong direction. An explanation of the productivity performance. So with some abuse, let me call that divide modern versus traditional. Now, and as I understand your story, that this is the misallocation, or the growing misallocation is caused by the subsidization of resources in the traditional or the non-salaried part of the economy, that there are a combination of labor market and social security policies that effectively are pushing resources into the traditional part. Now, if that is true, actually, as I understand it, your TFPR is really just a measure of profitability at market prices, and the actual productivity performance would then be even worse. The misallocation would be even worse because the measured profitability is propped up by these subsidies in the traditional sector. So, if anything, the misallocation is much worse in the way that it's been measured with this TFPR. Now, is that correct? The second question is, let's put this in a bit of a longer context of Mexican development. Before 1980, we know that TFP growth was very good in Mexico. We don't have anything like the data that you presented for the pre-1980 period, but it's a safe assumption that what was going on during this period, if you will, the classic 1950 to 1980 period of Mexican development, was that in fact it was the reverse, that that productivity growth was being spurred by labor and capital moving in the salaried direction, away from the traditional into the modern. So what has happened in between is, first of all, the question is, so these incentives must have gotten worse. So is that the case? So what changed in between? But secondly, there was the other change that everybody has mentioned, that in some sense, all the policies in the Mexican economy became better. You would have expected that the cumulative effect of all these policies would have been to increase the rewards for the modern sector, for the salaried sector, in particular the effect of NAFTA and trade opening and trade agreements. So, I mean, there's something, it's not just this, something else happened, that the effect of those other incentives must have supported, or at least must not have outweighed, and which is very surprising given the extent, how large the overall reform of the Mexican economy was, that should have moved relative incentives in the direction of the modern sector. If you can comment on that. On Gordon's last very interesting slide, I guess I would be right in that most of that convergence is really the worsening of income inequality in the United States, and not the somewhat more modest increase in inequality, equality in Mexico. Is that correct?
Okay, I'm going to come back to panel, brief replies, and then we'll go back to the audience. So whoever would like to respond to those.
Well, I would agree with Angel. I think that this story could be made much better if we had microdata. We do have some. In fact, the efforts that the central bank and also the banking commission are doing to precisely try to have credit data at the firm level are important efforts. I think that these statistics, to begin with, have not been very good traditionally. First for macroeconomic analysis, and now, since probably 2 or 3 years ago, and basically at the firm level, I think that there is an important effort amongst several, let's say, agencies to try to improve this data. And I do agree that perhaps if we had that data, we could disentangle, channels like the one Santiago was saying and the one that I'm saying, and so on. And I think that's something that we have to do. I think that the answer to your question is evident. The more we work with microdata, probably the more robust and the better the stories that come out of that. So, I agree with what you said.
Okay, we'll go to Gordon next. Perhaps
I'll cede my time to Santiago.
Okay.
So quickly on Finn's question, we see exit means exit. If you change sector, we would still see it in the panel data, in the data of the census, because the census is the census of everybody. So if the firm was in 2008, but it's not in 2013, it left. The firm closed down. If you change sector, we would have seen it. On Danny's 2 points, first the easier point, and then the more complicated point. These are, I didn't mention this, and I should have. I'm basically following Ciclino in the measurement of all the revenue productivity calculations. So in principle, these are the clean from taxes and subsidies, trying to pick up exactly the underlying productivities of the firms. But they're pretty bad as they are. And the point is that they're large and they're growing. The deeper question, and is your sort of more difficult question, is what changed from the 1990s? And I don't have a full story, but I have some components of the story, I think. And one component of the story, which I believe is there, is that the social insurance system taxed formal contracts. Because firms have to pay something approximately like 30 to 35% of the wage in a bundle of contributory social insurance benefits. But the quality of these benefits has been deteriorating because the health system provided to formal workers, and I used to work in that institution, the quality of the health services has been coming down by various objective indicators because the pension system doesn't really work very well. Most workers are not really going to get a pension. So that the value that people attach to this is actually been dwindling. So that by itself would say there's an implicit increasing tax on salaried contracts. But a second component that adds to that story is that
from the early 1990s, what has happened in Mexico is the realization that many workers who were not covered, in your language, in the traditional sector, were not accessing social insurance benefits. So the government started to create programs for them that parallel the programs for the workers in the modern sector, or the formal sector in my language. And that has grown a lot. I didn't mention that in my presentation, but to give a sense of that, I've been working the data back, and Arturo Arton is helping me, he's sitting around here somewhere. But about 15 years ago, the government spent about 0.6% of GDP subsidizing informal work. Now it's spending about 1.7% of GDP. So you've, over the last 15 years, added more than 1%, like 1.2% of GDP in additional programs that compete, but that from the point of view of informal workers are free, and more importantly, from the point of view of informal firms are free. So to give a sense of the orders of magnitude, Progresa takes 0.4% of GDP. And there are a lot of papers showing that 0.4% of GDP change a lot of behavior. This is 1.7% of GDP. And there's papers showing individually for some of the components of these non-contributory programs that they are indeed pulling resources into the informal sector. Nobody has done a paper, as far as I know, in which they add up everything else. So you had two forces, to summarize: a tax on formality that is growing over time, and a subsidy to informality that is growing over time. Those two things produce these numbers. And then taxes, also part of the story. Ravi has a very interesting paper in showing how special tax regimes that have kinks will trap firms and impede them from growing because the discontinuity that it implies in their profit function. And we have also that kind of tax regimes in Mexico. So whenever I think of these numbers, I think of a patient that arrived at the hospital and he had 4 bullets in the heart, and people try to identify which bullet killed him. And so it's the social insurance regime, it's the tax regime, and it's the credit story that Manuel was saying. And the sum of all that is this persistent misallocation.
Okay. So if we're very quick, we have 5 more minutes, we can do that. Let's go. Who's got the mic? If you go sort of five rows back first, and then keep going back, Yeah. Here, and then we'll come forward.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I'm Ana Laura Martinez, PhD candidate at CIDE. And I was wondering about the feedback effects between informality and credit that Dr. Ramos mentioned. And thinking about that, how important is the structure of the Mexican economy, as Santiago said, that is characterized by a majority of small firms and informal firms? How that affect the growth of credit, and especially when you have surveys capturing self-discrimination from formal credit markets? I was wondering what you think about that.
Okay, so we're moving forward here.
Hi, I'm Hugo Diaz, and my question is, since Mexico is growing very slow, like 1.5% per year in average, the last 3 decades, what other factors influence this trend, like considering political, economic, monetary, fiscal policy, industrial policy, labor policy, or foreign trade policy? It seems they are not aligned toward the same objective of getting rapid growth. There is another variable: social, political, and cultural factors, like corruption, public insecurity, discrimination. What do you think about it?
Okay, thank you very much. So, at the back there, and then that'll be the last question, I'm afraid. So keep it brief if you could.
Thank you. My name is Kieran Pry, and I was wondering how much the changes in the US, the kind of drastic structural changes, as for example documented by Alto and Dawn, have changed the relationship between Mexico and the US in terms of trade and also in terms of migration. and how much this drastic internal US changes has affected Mexican growth. Thank you.
Okay, so one last tour of the panel if people would like to respond to those questions, but briefly so, if you would.
Yeah, let me very briefly say some things about the first question. Oddly enough, if you take, from the data that I presented, the high concentration sector, you have sort of like two extremes in that sector. You have monolithic, traditionally very long time living monopolies, for example in telecommunications and so on, even although that supposedly is being addressed now by the reform. But you also have other services sectors like commerce or restaurants or whatever that are basically in many cases really operate to a very large degree in the informal sector. In fact, even some large firms that you would perceive or that you would think that they would basically be operating 100% in the formal sector, you see part of their operations are also in informality. If you look at, for example, occupation in the informal sector in Mexico is about 30%. But if you look at the rate of informality, it's about 60%, which means that also many firms, the rate of informality is 60%, which also means that many firms that supposedly are operating completely in the formal sector are also at least having part of their operations in the formal sector. Now, where I'm leading at is that basically you get this market power both in the formal sector and oddly enough also in the informal sector. And you are getting from some of the results that we have easily, well, not easily, but certainly in an easier way credit to those sectors that show concentration, high degree of concentration, whether they are big monopoly firms or whether they are also operations in the informal sector, but for some degree they can also exploit some kind of monopoly power. And there you would probably get some time of feedback in terms of the misallocation of resources and dynamic inefficiencies that both Santiago and I were talking about. But certainly this is only sort of like a back of the envelope response. Of course, we would have to go more to the microdata as Angel was suggesting to try to get more precise sort of like answer concerning what kind of feedback we get in terms of informality and the type of credit allocation that we get to try to sort of like get the overall dynamic inefficiency better quantified.
Okay, Gordon?
So on the last question regarding structural changes in the U.S. and what it means for Mexico, I think we have changes, technological change and the impact of globalization in the U.S. economy cut different ways in terms of their impact on Mexico. I think the work that David Otter and David Dorn have done on hollowing out, if we think of the process of automation that has driven that as keeping a set of industries in the United States that continue to demand the services of Mexican labor, then that process of technological change has kept in North America a set of industries that, absent that technological change, might have been lost to China. So that would be a potentially positive force for labor demand coming from the United States. Working against that, though, is what Otter, Dorn, and I have documented in our work, looking at the impact of globalization on manufacturing and employment decline in the United States. And there we're saying hollowing out of manufacturing in general. And what that does is reduce the number of industries with which Mexico could partner to form a robust North American production network. So on net, which has been more important, the automation effects on U.S. manufacturing were really concentrated in the 80s and 1990s. In the 2000s, it switched to services. Whereas in the 2000s, that was the sector where U.S. manufacturing really took it on the chin in terms of globalization. So of late, you would see the net impact of those two forces. I would speculate as having hurt Mexico on net in terms of generating demand for Mexican workers coming out of its relationship with the United States.
Okay, and the final word to Santiago.
So, I mean, your question on the political economy of all this is very complicated and very many angles. I just want to mention a point which I think Manuel's also mentioned. This equilibrium the politics behind the numbers that I showed before is a very robust equilibrium. It has been going on for 2 decades. There have been many changes of administration. And if you think about it, it's an equilibrium in which informal workers are actually better off, because even though they're working in very, very low productivity firms, they are receiving increasing amount of social transfers from various social insurance programs. So they have more access to pensions, they have more access to health. So this is being funded, of course, from the general revenues of the budget, and there's some oil rents that come there, and this is a mechanism in which oil rents are somehow shared with everybody. So it's a political equilibrium that is very stable, but from the point of view of productivity, is very perverse.
Thank you very much. Just two final points in closing the session. I was struck as I've been listening to this how many countries around the world are having such similar debates about growth. The kind of mantra that if you have macroeconomic stability, monetary and fiscal stability, there's some guarantee of high growth performance is something that I think has been firmly consigned to the litter bin if it hadn't already. And the experience since the financial crisis, I think, has been particularly striking in that respect. But the other thing, I think, which is equally striking is there's still far too much focus on manufacturing. Many, many economies have large tails of very inefficient service sectors. And we are struggling in the UK, and I know many other economies, in knowing how to think about raising the productivity of low productivity services, where increasingly you have very, very large fractions of the population are being employed. So the debate is around the part of the economy that we have better data on and we can study much better, and of course where there's more international trade. But very often the productivity puzzle and challenge is not there anymore. It's in a very different place in a lot of economies. Anyway, fantastic panel, I thought, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I have one final announcement before releasing you for coffee. The presidential address has been moved to 6 p.m., so you'll be able to get to dinner a little bit earlier. So after the final panels of sessions of the day, we'll come straight back in here and we can get the day wrapped up about 30 minutes earlier than we had originally planned. So it'll be 6 p.m. rather than I think it was advertised as being 6:30. Very good. Thank you very much.